The entire world watched in anticipation as two chess legends faced off in the World Chess Championship, Game 1. The entire match lasted 6 weeks and was one of the first major chess events to ever be televised. Bobby Fischer, representing the United States, and Boris Spassky, the reigning world champion from the Soviet Union, battled it out in a match that would go down in chess history. Spassky had white. The match started with Bobby Fischer absent. Spassky, at the allotted time, made his first move, pawn to e4, hit the clock, and sat back to wait. Fischer arrived 9 minutes later, shook Spassky's hand, and made his move, knight to f6, initiating the Nimzo-Indian defense. Now, Boris Spassky tended to be a slow starter. He liked to play conservatively in the first few games. He certainly did not mind drawing the first game if he could. He consequently played into a quiet variation of the Nimzo-Indian defense set up by Fischer. The first several moves were a book. Opening with the queen's pawn tends to be theoretically leading to a quieter, more strategic game. The first moves also start to establish a claim on the center, as well as free his dark-squared bishop. Black's first move starts to contest White's claim to the center, as well as discourages e4. White's second move is also very much like the English, restricting Black from d5 and a center pawn majority. e6 supports d5 and would allow Black to occupy the d5 square as he initially intended to. It also opens his dark-squared bishop. Spassky develops his knight and supports the center. Black plays d5 as planned. Knight to c3 develops another minor piece. It helps support the center and ignores Black's move to his d5. If Black captures d times c, White maintains a center pawn majority, 2 center pawns, and will recover his lost point with his bishop after the e-pawn moves. Any play by Black to hold onto this pawn advantage will ultimately weaken his position, and Black almost always lets it go. Black develops his dark-squared bishop, allowing for castling short, as well as pinning White's knight against his king. White frees his light-squared bishop and supports his d4 pawn in the process. White is not concerned about the potential of doubled pawns should the bishop take the knight. Double pawns are not always bad, and Black would lose his bishop pair. So Black castled short. White develops his light square bishop to d3. While there is the potential for a tempo loss, a loss of time and a turn, should Black now take on c4, White chose the better diagonal for his bishop and prepared for castling short. c5 threatens White's center pawn majority, slightly frees the queen, and gets the pawn in front of the knight. White castles short as well, and the knight develops. Now White chooses to put the question to the bishop. Black withdraws the bishop to a5. More usual is d times c, with b times c and bishop to a5, bishop to d3, though this tends to give White a slight edge. With this move, White declared that he was unable or unwilling to see a continuation, which would be, at the very least, somewhat promising. That being c times d, e times d, and d times c. Black chooses to break open the center. The action's about to begin. White recovers the point and defends his bishop. Black defends his c-pawn. While they may appear to be questionable moves, since b6 would have done the same thing but allows the bishop freedom of movement to avoid being trapped, as well as begins aiming at White's king. Yes, there are many pawns between them, but that will not last forever. Black is planning for the future. Now White takes the pawn, inviting an exchange of the queens, which Black happily does, and White takes back, placing his rook on a good open file. Black recovers his lost point now, defending his hanging bishop and aiming still at the white's king side. White harasses the bishop, advancing his b pawn, and the bishop pulls back to safety. White now takes the long b2 diagonal, aiming at black's king, and Fischer had to somehow get this bishop into the game, as well as his rooks. They're both still on the back rank, doing nothing. White moves his a-file rook onto the second open file, and further analysis has shown that e4 or even knight from e to d4 would have been more dynamic. If e4, the knight cannot capture the pawn without losing his d-file bishop. The threat then would have been e5, winning either material or tempo. And this move neutralizes the potential of e4. So now, the knight from e2 to d4 was played by Spassky, which Fischer took, and Spassky took back again with his knight. The bishop moves down to threaten the rook, and Spassky's bishop pulls back to stop that threat. Fischer decides to exchange the pieces, which is absolutely fine with Spassky. And now Fischer continues exchanging the pieces. Again, Spassky's on a good open file. So of course, Fischer is now moving his rook to an open file as well. Okay, now White is moving his king towards the center, eliminating any potential of a back rank mate, and planning for the endgame, which this is obviously going to go into. And Black does the same thing. White starts moving towards the center with his king, activating his king, making it a more active player. Fischer moves his knight down to stop any potential defense against his rook's intrusion. So as a result, White moves his rook to c1 to stop the threat and potentially encourage yet another exchange. A draw is becoming more and more likely. So Black exchanges rooks, and White takes back with his bishop. Now Fischer starts to move his pawns down, again heading towards the endgame. Spassky activates or reactivates his knight, threatening the b pawn. And Fischer pulls his knight back to defend it. The king moves even closer to the center. And Fischer pulls back his bishop to get into a more active position. Spassky tries to encourage yet another exchange. And Fischer moves his bishop to c7, aiming down a long diagonal towards the pawns. So Spassky takes, and Fischer takes back. And now Spassky moves his pawns off the color of the bishop and pushes them even further. This move made the entire crowd gasp. This was a horrible move, at least by theory. Okay? That is a poisoned pawn. All White has to do is push his g pawn forward one, and that bishop is not getting out. It was a horrible mistake. It was a mistake that Fischer later said had everything to do with all the noise in the room. He was always complaining that the noise from the cameras and the camera crew and the audience was very distracting. He thought, however, he could get back out of this. He was wrong. The pawn pushes forward, trapping the bishop in. So Fischer starts to move his h-pawn down to try to help the bishop. And the king starts going after the bishop. Pawn moves yet again, with the thought that h times g, f times g, bishop takes, and the bishop will be free. However, Spassky wasn't going to allow that. So Fischer starts to move his king back into the action, knowing that it's going to take Spassky a little time to get to his bishop. The king moves closer to the bishop, and the pawn from h takes g, trying to defend the bishop, at least momentarily, getting something for his loss. Pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, and goodbye bishop. That was probably the biggest mistake in this entire game. Now black is centralizing his king, and despite the fact though that Spassky, white, is up 1 point, black has some seriously connected passed pawns. So white starts building a queenside defense for his own pawns, pushing the A pawn, making it a little bit more difficult for the black king to get in there. The king, however, is going to try. So Spassky moves his bishop to a good post, making it impossible for the king to come around and get in. So the king moves once more towards the center and towards a weak pawn. And Spassky defends that pawn. Fischer pushes on the pawn to attack it, and Spassky pushes so that it's defended by the bishop as well. Fischer's now trying to push his pawns, trying to take advantage of his greater pawn structure on that side. In a kind of surprising move, now Spassky starts to go around after the pawns himself. Fischer pushes the pawn, inviting an exchange, which does occur, and now Spassky's going up after the other pawn. The king's coming up to try to stop that. And Spassky moves his bishop down, trying to aim at the other diagonal as well, trying to hold the king at bay, which stops g5. King moves towards the bishop, and the bishop pulls back once more. Now Fischer's king had to go back, or he would have dropped the g-pawn. And the bishop comes up to once again stop g5. So Fischer stops pushing his central pawn, and he brings his bishop to g5, stopping that pawn. Fischer, however, pushes nonetheless, and Spassky interposes his bishop. King goes to f6 to further defend the pawn. Spassky starts to move in, and the king once more comes back. What Spassky has just accomplished, though, is called triangulation. He moved from h5 to g4 to g5. That little triangle actually buys you a turn. It buys you a tempo. So black starts to move towards the other pawns, and Spassky moves towards the center. Black has almost no good moves at this point. His position is very close to a zugzwang. White simply maintains the restrictions around the e-pawn. Black has no better thing to do than to push the g-pawn, which Spassky takes. The king starts to move around to go after the other pawn, and Spassky brings his king over. King moves over to attack the pawn yet again. Spassky takes the pawn, and Fischer takes the pawn. Now Spassky starts to move his king in closer. Fischer moves his king up to get it out of the way of the a-pawn. Spassky now starts to circle around to go after the b-pawn, and black, Fischer, resigned. There was no way he could stop the king from taking the b-pawn, then moving out of the way and promoting the b-pawn, while his pawn on the a-file could be stopped by the bishop, even if the bishop had to sacrifice itself. So it's a totally lost game. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe, hit the bell, and have a great day.